So as I started saying, my name is Joe Flowers, and I am a certified Salesforce Technical Instructor. I like long walks on the beach, and my mom thinks I'm a great catch. Wait, that's the wrong meeting, sorry. Okay, so the way that I kind of got involved with this and had the idea to come and speak to you all this week. Back at TDX, I actually delivered a boot camp on Lightning Web Components, and I've been a Salesforce DEC 601 or Aura instructor for over a year and a half now. So I've been teaching the Aura class many times. I teach a lot of private workshops at companies, and when the boot camp opportunity came up to teach Lightning Web Components, I jumped on that as quickly as I could. So at the time, that was a 2-day course, and that was offered back in May at TDX. And then they needed somebody to help change that from a 2-day course to a full 5-day course and sort of mirror what we had done with our Aura class. Myself, in conjunction with Radislav Radkova, I don't know if anybody here knows her, but her name's Rad, we worked together on converting the 2-day course into a 5-day course. And so I have a very solid understanding of going from what it's like taking an application written in Aura and curriculum as well written in Aura and translating it for Lightning Web Components. We actually, prior to going to, so I had the good fortune of going to the Barcelona boot camp, and I actually attended I was attending as a student, which was fun, but I attended the B2C boot camp. But prior to doing that, since I don't go to Europe all that often, I actually met up with Rad, and we went to Amsterdam and gave this talk that you're going to visit tonight on. We gave a talk very similar to the one you're going to see tonight on at the Amsterdam user group. So this will be my second time kind of giving this shortened version. So I'm used to basically having 40 hours to speak about this topic, but tonight you're getting the 1-hour version. So it's a little bit like when going from 8-minute abs to 7-minute abs, right? So we've got so we're going to go for our try to condense it into as much information as I can into sort of a little bit of an amount of time with you. So of course, just in case I mention anything, this is just if you see anything, if I mention anything forward-looking statement, make your purchasing decisions based on anything that currently exists and nothing in the future. I don't really know if I need to do that at dev meetups, but force of habit, every time I teach a class, I mention this slide. So I created a Google Doc that I thought would be helpful for all of you, so please feel free to take a snapshot of this. And I'll open that document for you in just a moment, because what I'm going to be sharing with you tonight, we're going to start with a couple of different things. First of all, it's got lots of different links that you might find helpful, and it also has a link to the GitHub repository for the project we'll be looking at tonight. So let me go ahead and just take a second here to show you what that document looks like and outline the content that's available. So if I go to bit.ly, Aura to LWC, just because I don't want you, I'm very vain, I don't want you to forget what I look like. I put a nice little picture up there for me. And I've got the bit.ly URL in case you forget it. I've got my contact information. I enjoy connecting with people, so please feel free, connect on LinkedIn, Twitter, email me if you want to anytime. So I had to, of course, mention the product here as well a little bit. So this is going to be the, let me see here if I can zoom in a bit. Okay. So Lightning, that's what happens when So we've got DEC 602, which is the full 1-week class. So that's actually what I'm teaching this week here in San Francisco, is the full 1-week class of Lightning Web Components. This is very new, hot off the presses. The alpha for the class was back in July. I've taught it to one private client prior to this, and then this week the course is debuting in public workshops in both San Francisco and London simultaneously. So this is quite exciting, quite an exciting week for us, and it's been really fun having both Adam and Don in class with me, being super fun. So, and again, on this link, you've got a link to a project called Where's Astro, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. And I'll explain the genesis of this project and how we kind of came up with the idea to work on it. But we've got a link to the GitHub repo, so everything that you see today is going to be available for you to download, and you can actually, if you're familiar with Salesforce DX, it's really easy to just fire up a scratch org with the content that we've got. So hopefully you'll find that useful. I always know that I like to have code available to play with. We've got a couple more helpful links. So we've got the Build Lightning Web Components trail. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with Trailhead. And then we've got a link to the fun Learn Web Components in 1 hour I saw that a couple days ago on Twitter, and I thought I had to go ahead and share that. I know you guys shared it earlier as well, which is focused on Lightning Web Components open source. So I'm probably not going to have a whole lot of time to dive into the fact that there's a whole other open source product for Lightning Web Components tonight, but you should check that out and learn about it as well. I've got some links here to developer.salesforce.com to what I think are the most important things that you might want to check out, such as the sample gallery for applications. There's 11 videos in the for Lightning Web Component video gallery. There's a really cool feature that came out called LWC Local Development that you might want to check out, and just a link on debugging your Lightning Web Components. And then last but not least, as Don mentioned, Pluralsight has tons of different videos available to you. And there's a number of them that are available to you for free. So I've highlighted these free Pluralsight courses that I think would be helpful to anybody who's interested in the topics that we talked about today. And then, of course, there are paid Pluralsight courses. And I knew Don's link ahead of time, so I went ahead and put it in the document. But it looks like most of you guys already got it from the slide earlier today. So hopefully that'll be helpful to you all. So anyway, this document is viewable to anybody who needs it. So. All right, so how I kind of wanted to start this discussion was, first thing I'm going to do is just kind of give you a very brief lecture on just the notion of kind of pieces of Aura and what are their counterparts in Lightning Web Components, and just kind of come at you from the perspective of if you are an Aura developer and you are going to need to build Lightning Web Components, like kind of how do you get started and how do you translate the concepts that you know about into Lightning Web Components. Just so that I have a little bit of a reference kind of for how to tailor what I'm saying. How many of you have built Aura components before? If you can raise your hands. Okay, most of you in the audience have. How many of you have built Lightning Web Components before? A couple of you all have built some. Okay, cool. Looks like we got a pretty technical audience here, so that's great. So it looks like a lot of you will be able to get quite a bit out of that. So many of you are probably familiar with this, but when we look at a Lightning Web Component bundle, I like to think of the Web Component bundle, all of the different files, and their counterparts in Aura. So in our Web Components, we have a file called the template, which is going to be our view, our HTML, and it's just going to contain markup. So back in Aura, we commonly had expressions. We would register variables, and I'll talk about this and demonstrate it for you more a little bit later. So we've moved all of the variables out, the variable declarations, out of the markup and into the controller. So in our Lightning Web Components, we've got a better separation of concerns. So we've got the first thing we have is our template. So I kind of think of the template as mapping to the Aura component area. Then we've got our controller. So my controller so I'm giving examples of the file names here as well. So we've got our map file, okay, which is going to be our view, which maps to our component. We've got our JavaScript file. So when we worked inside of Aura, we had there are 3 different JavaScript files that we had access to. We had a controller, and our controller kind of played the role of traffic cop in an Aura component. And the sort of best practice was that we would put all of our event handlers that would respond to like our button clicks and so forth, but we would move most of our complicated logic over to a helper. And then we had a renderer JavaScript for a very specialized purpose. What we've kind of moved to inside of our Lightning Web Components is that we have a controller JavaScript file, and then we can import other JavaScript files and using what we call service components in order to encapsulate logic in other JavaScript files easily. But we don't have this explicit notion of the bundle being organized with a helper for us. So I personally love Lightning Web Components. I have a very strong preference for working with them over Aura, but kind of the one piece I miss from time to time is just having that clean separation into a helper file, but very small trade-off in my opinion. When we had our Aura components, we needed a way to say, what are all of the different places inside of the Salesforce ecosystem that I would like to use my Aura component? So when we implemented a component, inside of the markup, we had an Aura component tag, and we had a keyword or an attribute of that tag that said implements. The implements attribute would have something like Flexipage, available for all page types, or /app hostable. And these attributes would tell you, where can I use this Aura component throughout the ecosystem? So the analog for that in our Lightning Web Components is a configuration XML file. So it starts to feel much more similar to what you'll do everywhere else on the web. So we have an XML file that configures our component and says, here are all the places that we can use it. That actually also replaces what we called the design file in our Aura components as well. So we used a design file in order to say, when I configure a component, what are all of the different attributes that I need to expose when I am inside of Lightning App Builder. We have SVG icons available to us as well, and we also have CSS files that we can use in our bundle. Okay? At the moment, in Aura, we could do custom documentation. We don't have that ability at the moment in our Lightning Web Components. So I talked about the fact that we've moved properties out of the Aura markup and we've moved them into our JavaScript controller. So the sort of analog, or the analogs for all of our Aura attributes are going to be these properties. And in Aura, when we declared a property, or an attribute, I should say, we actually gave it a data type. We don't actually assign data types inside of our JavaScript controller. We don't need to do that. We still have a mechanism for declaring whether a property is public or private, and we have something called decorators. So you can see up here, I've got my string. A declaration of a just traditional JavaScript property here, is private property, is not going to have any what we call decorator. Then we have a property that is decorated with a @track. So I don't want you to confuse, if you're coming from an Apex background and you see the @ sign, the first thing you might think of is this must be an annotation. And it's not quite the same thing. So we have a couple of these things that are called decorators that are built into the modern web standards. You can build custom decorators yourself. And the Lightning Web Components, that's not part of standard web components. A lot of the stuff that we use inside of Lightning Web Components are standard. But Salesforce introduced these 3 decorators that we're going to look at. The first is track. So if I declare that a variable is an @track variable, what I am saying is this is a private variable, which means it cannot be set by any parent component. But what I do want it to happen is if I make a change to this variable, I want my entire component to re-render. So one of the things that we really want to think about when we're building our Lightning Web Components is the performance of the component. So when we talked about the reasoning for why Salesforce introduced Lightning Web Components to begin with, the main idea, there were a couple of main ideas, but the main thing was web standards have evolved a ton in the past 5 years, so they wanted to make sure to take advantage of the latest and greatest web standards, okay? And in addition to that, the consideration is performance. So by using Lightning Web Components, there are significant performance improvements over Aura. So I was actually talking to one of my students today who works for a big implementation partner, and he mentioned that he's seen something along the lines of a 30% performance increase on their components. And he was just telling this to me like I didn't bribe him or anything like that. So, and so it was really cool to hear that from somebody out in the wild who is already implementing Lightning Web Components and the performance improvement that they've seen. But if you want to see those performance improvements, you have to make sure that you use the tools we're giving you carefully. So @track is one of those tools. And every time you change the value of a property marked @track, it is going to re-render your component. So you should only mark a property with this decorator if you would like it to re-render the component every time it changes. Okay? It's a little bit like how you could have in Aura, you could have a number sign or an exclamation point whenever you had your component markup. It's a lot like that. So you just need to be mindful when you're using these properties of how you want them. With our attributes, we also have the ability to declare them as public. So why would I want to declare an attribute as public? There are a couple of instances. So we have a notion of a component hierarchy. So I can create a component, and then from one component, I can include another. And when we look at the reference application a little bit later on that I'll be demonstrating, we'll see just that. And by declaring a property as @API, that allows me to set a value on a child component from the parent. So I can pass values into a child component when I instantiate it, and that allows me to essentially take advantage of the modularity of these components. And you'll see an example of how we take advantage of a little bit later on. So if we come forward, I also mentioned the fact that we've moved our property declarations again out of the component markup and into JavaScript. So one of the cool things that you can see here is we no longer allow, there's a couple things. I mentioned this earlier, but if we do a $v.myString in Aura, that's not going to be reactive. It's not going to trigger and re-render every time that value changes, whereas our exclamation point would. So that's sort of analogous to what we just saw with the attrack properties or the properties that aren't tracked, okay? When we want to pass an attribute into a Lightning Web Component, we can say, so this see hello world, it might look a little bit goofy to you, but what that means is we are instantiating a component called hello world, and we are passing in a key value pair of name is equal to greeting. And in this case, we've declared greeting as a property hello world, okay? And so one of the important things in our markup, so I mentioned performance, and I mentioned standards. So one of the benefits of Lightning Web Components is that we're adhering to web standards, which means it's easier to get a developer off the street and bring them in and have them build Lightning Web Components, because now they're not learning this whole entire proprietary Aura framework, okay? Not that you couldn't learn it, but that there was just a bigger learning curve. So, so when we have our components here, we've got our see hello world and we're assigning properties. One of the benefits, in Aura, we had the ability to do something like concatenate strings inside of our expressions directly in the markup. That ability has gone away. So instead of doing that, we create expressions in our JavaScript, which we'll see in a little bit. And one of the benefits of that, Lightning Web Components are much more testable than Aura components were. So if you were familiar with Aura components and trying to test them with on the client side, there is a product called Lightning Testing Service. And so you could use that to test your Aura components, but now they've embraced Jest, which is another testing framework, and they've basically built it in so that it is much easier to do client-side testing of your JavaScript, of your components. So that's another benefit of moving to Lightning Web Components. Yes?
One question. So
sure.
I've seen that in traditional Apex, you have to specify whether the variable is integer or string or something.
Yes, so in Aura, we had to specify the data types. In Lightning Web Components, we're just using JavaScript, so we're not explicitly declaring a data type.
Got it. So can you change the data type later of that variable, or once it's something?
As long as you haven't declared it as a constant or something like that, you can set a variable to anything that you would like it to, for better or worse, right? So, great question, thanks. So, one of the things that we did in Aura was we had the ability to fetch data from our Apex classes, right? And so we've got two different ways that we can go about doing that from our Lightning Web Components. The first way that I'm going to introduce to you is going to feel very similar to the way that we did it in Aura. We're going to import a method. So we have a method here called getAllPhotos that you're going to see from our application. And then we've got a constructor. So in Aura, when we needed to perform something on initialization of a component, we had what we called an init handler. We said Aura handler, name is equal to init, and then we gave it the name of a JavaScript function that we would like to execute at any point in time. So in our Lightning Web Components, we have two different things that kind of take the place of those initialization handlers. One is called the constructor. The constructor is as if you were working with C++ or Java or .NET. It's just like anything else. If you're going to instantiate a class, you have a constructor, and you can essentially override the constructor and put any code in here that you would like to execute when the component is getting built. We have another lifecycle hook we'll talk about a little bit later on that is also commonly used called connected callback, and it is built into the web specification as well. But in that, that is waiting until the component is actually getting inserted into the DOM. So in this case, all we're doing is making a call to Apex. So inside of our constructor for our component, we're calling super, which means all of our components extend a common Lightning element class that is part of the framework. And so we are saying, please go ahead and use the standard constructor, but then call this method getAllPhotos. So what this is doing is it's going to call that Apex method that we imported here up at the top. So this should look a lot cleaner to you than having to create an action and then set a callback and do all that kind of stuff. Because this getAllPhotos method is going to return a promise. And so we can say .then, and then we can do whatever we would like to do with the result of that call. So this is one way that we can access data from Apex inside of our Lightning Web Components. It's a convenient way because it feels to me like we have a lot of control, and it feels like what we've done in Aura components in the past, just with less code. There's another way that we can fetch data from our Apex classes. And if this looks like magic, it feels like magic too, okay? So this is what we call wire service. So this is the second option for reading data from our Apex classes. So we can import a method. Again, we're importing that method getAllPhotos. That line hasn't changed a bit, but we are going to use a decorator called wire. So I introduced you to two decorators earlier. One was track and one was API. And what this slide is going to do is allow us to just say wire getAllPhotos to a property called photos. Now, you have a little bit less control here because this wire service is going to run at a certain point in the component lifecycle. It's in between the constructor and the connected callback, I believe. But the point being that we don't have quite as much control over when it runs. However, we also don't really have to write any code here. We're basically just saying, give me all the photos here, and when you're done, put them in a variable here called photos. And it will give you back an object that contains data or an error. And we'll look at a working example of that as well. So we looked at wire service in order to fetch data from Apex. But if you have a background in either Visualforce using the standard controller or Aura using Lightning Data Service, you might wonder, is there a way for us to load data from the back end without writing any Apex? And there is a mechanism for us to do that. And that's going to be a method called getRecord that we can import from the UI API. So Lightning Data Service is always sat on top of an API called the UI API, User Interface API. When you were working with it from Aura, you didn't really know about it or thinking about it. So you had that force record data tag, and you were making a call with a record ID. So wire service is going to be very similar to using force record data. There's a couple of pros and cons to it. The first is that you can only query by record ID. The second is that you can only get single records back, right? So you can only query by record ID, only get single records back. But what's really nice about this, it is very performant. So you don't have to write any classes, Apex classes on the back end to return any data. And I will say that if you look at all the methods for the user interface API in the back end, it looks like they are building out methods to get more than one record at a time, like to get lists of records from a particular object type. So keep your eyes peeled on that kind of stuff as well. But what we've done in order to call getRecord on the back end is we have said, import this field name, import field description. So one of the things that I came from a traditional database application server background before I ever touched Salesforce, and I was used to writing SQL. I remember when I first started writing SQL queries, I would try to do select star from wherever. And it would say, like, you can't do this. So I Googled, like, select star Salesforce, and they're like, yeah, sorry, you can't do that. But what was interesting about it was that it actually made me think a little bit more about, okay, it does make a lot of sense. We have these limitations placed on us because we're working in a shared hosting environment. If I write bad code, it won't just impact me, but it could impact you as well. So they've done a really good job of setting in a set of rules and standards that you literally have to abide by. It's not just best practices, but I can't do select star even if I want to. So when we do an import here, what we're basically doing is writing out the list of columns that we would like to select from our backend. So what's really nice about this as well is that it enforces the schema at compile time. So if you try to select a field with Lightning Data Service that does not exist, rather than wait until runtime to have an error, it's going to actually happen. You're not going to be able to push this metadata. You're not going to be able to create this Lightning Web Component if you include a field that does not exist. So we've got our name field and our description field. And here what we've done is we have wired up getRecord, And so this looks a little bit longer than what we had before. We now have a record ID that we are passing in, and we have an array of the fields that we would like to pass in. So we've got get record, the ID of the record we're passing in, an array of the fields that we would like to pass in, and we have got our property name down here. When we worked inside of Aura, we communicated between components using events. So if we wanted to communicate between events that were in the same DOM tree, same branch of the DOM tree, we would fire a component event from any of our components, and it would bubble up the hierarchy and just go up in, so it would go, in this example, from Astro Map to Map Container up to the app page. So we could communicate within the same tree. And then if we wanted to communicate across the boundaries, we would have to use something else. We would use an application event. If we wanted to, so we're going to have something called a custom event in our Lightning Web Components. So very, very similar to a custom event, we can fire, very similar to a component event in Aura, we can fire a custom event in our Lightning Web Components. There are a couple of crucial differences. In Aura, we actually had to create an event file and explicitly say, here are all of the properties that I would like to pass in this event. And then we would have to register the event in the markup as well. In Lightning Web Components, it feels a little bit more loosey-goosey, to use a very scientific term. So you can fire a custom event from anywhere in your JavaScript. You don't have to have registered that event. You don't have to have created a file with the name of that event. So it is much, much simpler. So from the controller anywhere, it's just very easy to use custom events. And then you can listen for that custom event in any of the components that are above your component in the hierarchy. Now, of course, in a minute, I'm going to talk about how you can cross onto other pieces of the DOM. But just for a moment, I want to talk about how do we go downwards in the tree. So I just told you that if I have a component and it's got, let's say it's the grandchild, so we've got our, or it's nested component inside of another, it's the child component. I can fire an event to go upwards. If I'd like to go downwards, there's really two different ways to think about how we can do that communication. The first is to pass attributes, which is kind of what we looked at earlier. I introduced the fact that you could decorate a property with @API, and when you decorate the property with that, it becomes publicly available for any component to pass into. So if I have my map container here, I could pass an array of latitude and longitude coordinates with all of my map markers. That's a little bit of a preview for where we're going, okay? And I could pass that downwards. The other thing that I could do is call a public method on that component. So I can expose a method. I can define a function in my controller, and I can decorate it with the @API decorator. So we saw that I could mark a property as @API. I can mark a function the same way, and that turns it into a public method. In Aura, we had to, inside of our markup, we would say Aura:\method, and then we would provide the name of a method, and we would define the arguments, and we would, from those arguments, we would call a function in the Aura controller. So again, we just have a function, we decorate it with that API, and it's quite simple and easy to use. Okay, so when we go down, we can use either properties or public methods. If we would like to communicate across the DOM, okay, so in this case, what you're going to see is we're going to have two components. One's called Astro Map, one's called Astro Table, and then we have a parent component called Map Container. If I would like to communicate from that container component to other components in the DOM, in our Aura components, we would use something called an application event. So an application event, I like to think of it as the sunshine type of event because or like a loudspeaker. So I'm not just talking upwards, I'm talking to everybody in the room, okay? So an application event would get fired, and any component that wanted to listen for this application event could. So we have a similar mechanism to this in in Lightning Web Components. I will tell you this with a caveat. So Lightning Web Components came out, and the one piece of Lightning Web Components that they pretty much acknowledged was not 100% built out was the equivalent for application events. So what they did as sort of a temporary mechanism was they provided what we call PubSub. It is a custom component that they built that you can go and grab from the recipes repo, and you can pull it into your project. And from any of your components, you can fire an event. You can basically register an event that you would like to fire, and you can fire that event. And from any of your other components on the page, you can register a listener. So it serves the same way that an application event did, but it was not really intended. Even if you look in the code, it basically says, keep an eye out for a more robust solution coming in the future. Now, if you check out the Winter 20 release notes, and I will admit, I have not had a chance to work with them in great detail, but there is something called Lightning Messaging Service that's getting introduced that looks like a replacement for our application events. That's just something that it looks like, and it's in developer preview right now. Who knows if it'll change, maybe it'll go away completely. But right now, right this second, if you would like to implement the equivalent of an application event, or in other words, communicate across branches of the DOM tree, you're going to want to use the pub sub module. And I will show you a working example of that in a little bit. Okay, so in Aura, if we wanted to work with third-party JavaScript, we use LTNG:require. So there's this kind of interesting namespace, LTNG, that really didn't have a whole lot other than this require component. And we would provide the name of the static resource that had our script, and then we would provide an after scripts loaded that would be what we would like to execute once the script was done. In our Lightning Web Components, what we're going to do is we can import our static resource. So we can import my resource name from whatever the name of your static resource is. And then we're going to import a couple of different functions here. We have both load script and load style. Either one of these, so load style would be used to load a CSS file from a static resource. And then load script would be used in order to load a JavaScript file from a static resource. So we are, of course, you have to upload that file as a static resource. Well, in this particular mechanism, we are uploading the file as a static resource, I should say. So what I want to take you to now is I want to introduce you to the fun little application that I built that will allow you to kind of get a feel for all of these components in a very tight package. So the name of this application is called Where's Astro? And the inspiration for this, so of course that's a hashtag you've probably seen on Twitter quite a bit. And the inspiration for this application came from when I was in Toronto. So we had a really good time. So because I worked on the development of this course, the DEC 602 5-day, I also was able to attend the alpha for this course in Toronto. And we had a chance, I got there a day early, and several of us went to Niagara Falls together. And so we had a great time there. And one of the people who was with us took a picture of Astro with Niagara Falls behind it and tweeted it out and got lots of likes. And I was like, it would be kind of fun to see a collection of pictures like that. And so, and then I thought it would be kind of fun ultimately, and I have not gotten this far yet, it would be fun to build a user-generated site around that, right? So kind of reach out to people in the community who have little Astros, have them take pictures around. So that was kind of my long-term idea. But I wanted to give this developer talk, I wanted to give a developer talk while I was out, and I thought, why don't I go ahead and at least start building this project out as sort of a way to be able to teach people in a tight package some of these concepts about Lightning Web Components. So we're really going to have 4 different components that we're going to look at here. We've got a map component here outlined by yellow. We've got a table component outlined by maroon. We've got a map container component outlined in black. And we've got our map item detail outlined in green. And when I talked about the difference between our custom events and our pub sub, if we want to communicate between our table and our map container, we can use those custom events because they go up. But if we want to communicate over to our map item detail, it's not in the same branch of the DOM tree, so we have to use a pub sub event, or if it was Aura, it would have been an application event. So I've included a link, and this link is also available to you in that Google document that I shared earlier, but this is a link to the GitHub repository that contains the project that you're going to check out tonight. Okay, so that was the really quick kind of spiel, at least it felt very quick to me, spiel about kind of the differences between Aura and LWC. And what I'd like to do now is take you into the actual working application. So let me open up. I want to take you into the working application and then kind of walk you through the code for a little bit and just kind of demo a couple of the different pieces to you. So let me load up my page here, and I'm going to reload so you can just see the experience from the get-go. Okay, so when the page initially loads, I've got a bunch of points on a map, and then I've also got a table down here, a Lightning data table. Okay, so one of the things that you may or may not be aware of is that there is a component reference. There are a bunch of built-in, out-of-the-box Lightning web components that are available to you to use. One of them is a Lightning data table. So I've taken advantage of that component down here. So when we look at the map component, when we look at the table component, it will take advantage of that Lightning data table. This map component that we've got up top is using an external library, a third-party library called Leaflet. So if you've worked with Aura or Lightning Web Components, you might be aware that there is a Lightning map component available to you. The problem with this Lightning map component that's available is I want it to be able to do something whenever you click on one of these markers. And you do not have the ability to do something when you click a marker from the Google Maps. So Leaflet is a third-party JavaScript library that I used in place of it. So whenever I click on one of these markers, what I can see is I've got a picture of Astro in that location. And so I can click a bunch of these different locations. So kind of a funny story about this picture was I didn't know that the I in I Amsterdam was such an important piece. So I happened to be in Amsterdam for my developer talk. And so I cut out the I in I Amsterdam. But I did take this picture. And then I got yelled at for not including the I. It's been fun collecting these pictures. Some of them I took or a friend took or a couple different friends took. So we've got pictures of a little Astro in various locations. And again, the sort of inspirational picture was my favorite one, which is Astro at Niagara Falls with the background, okay? So what's really neat about this little application is there's actually a lot going on underneath the hood. So there's a couple things that I want to point out to you. Okay, first of all, we're using a third-party JavaScript library for the map. Okay, that's pretty cool. Second of all, when I click on any of these markers, it's communicating with my component over there along the right. Third of all that it's doing is broadcasting what's the ID of the point that I just clicked. So I'm going to show you in the code how the detail component actually fetches the information using that ID. Fourth thing that's really cool is as I'm clicking around these components up at the top, I don't know if you can tell, but it's actually on the bottom updating which of those items is selected. So I'm able to demonstrate, and then it also vice versa. If I click along the bottom, any of these, it is changing the tooltip on the map to indicate which one of these is selected. So again, looks like a very bite-sized application, but it actually covers a lot of these concepts that we've talked about. Because I'd like to go back here to let's see if I get the full screen on my first try here. No, I'll go 2 tries. Give it a second here. What I want to show you is just take a minute to talk about where all those different pieces play in. Okay, so you saw how it kind of keeps the two in sync. So I'm able to click on an item, and it keeps these in sync. So the way that I'm able to do that is one of the patterns that we preach with any of our component designs is we will take a child component, and then we will fire a component event up to a container, and then have that container be what we call a dispatcher component. And the dispatcher component is responsible for kind of doing something with that event. In this case, what it's doing is 2 things. One is it's actually maintaining what is my currently selected photo, and it's passing that property. We're able to call public methods on either of these 2 components. So if I click a button down here, it's going to fire a custom event up to the container and call a public method on the map. If you click a button on the map, it fires a custom event up to the container and calls a public method down here, on the table. And in either case, when we click on one of these items, it also fires, it uses pub sub to speak over to the to the element that's not part of the DOM tree, which is that map item detail along the right side. And I introduced to you earlier the fact that we could use what we called our user interface API to fetch information from our backend very easily. So what I want to do now is just kind of take you through some of those components quickly and show you what they look and feel like. So I've got my Lightning Web component, and the first thing I have is the map container. So the map container, I need to probably switch my theme here. Let's see, code, preferences. I think I'll go light. It's a little better, and I'll zoom in a bit. Zooming in will help quite a bit. I'll get rid of the, all right, that should be a little bit better. Let me get rid of the mini map. Okay, so you guys read this okay, kind of, sort of? Sure. So we've got, up here, we've got our template. And again, this is all available to you in the GitHub repository that you can check out after class. You should be able to build a Scratch org and play with the app yourself, too. So the map container, the markup piece is really simple. We've got our Astro Map, and we are passing in photos. So I mentioned the fact that we could create an API property earlier, and we are passing the same photos array into both our map and our data table. And in both cases, we are passing, we have a handler. So when the marker on the map gets clicked, I'd like to do something. When an item in the table gets clicked, I'd like to do something. So I'm going to go into my controller. If you've never worked with the breadcrumbs in Visual Studio, by the way, it's a really neat way to navigate between your components. So I'm going to click my breadcrumb up here for my map container. And so when I click my map container HTML, I can see the other files from the bundle. And I'm going to click the JavaScript. So I can see that I've got a decent amount of JavaScript here. But a couple of key concepts that I'm going to point out to you from this JavaScript. The first is we are importing a method called getAllPhotos, and that's going to get all of the data for those photos that we have listed. The second thing we've done is I have an attrack property called photos. So I'm going to use the imperative apex to say, give me all the photos, and when it comes back, store them in my property called this.photos. We have a method called broadcast selection, and we're going to broadcast the selection whether or not the marker got clicked or if the grid got selected. So broadcast selection is going to be that sunshine event. So I like to use the word broadcast whenever I'm doing the application event or the pub sub, because I think it makes it clear that everybody's supposed to hear this. So when I handle a marker click, I'm broadcasting my selection, and then what I'm doing here is I am calling the public method setGridSelection. So when my marker items get clicked, when I click on one of the map items, I need to update the grid. So in Aura, we had the ability to assign what we called an Aura ID. And we would assign an Aura ID, and then we would say component.find, and we would use the Aura ID to get a reference to the component, and then we could call public methods that way. Inside of our Lightning Web components, we have a slightly different approach. We are going to use another standards-based approach, and that's to use a standard DOM function called querySelector. We're going to call querySelector to get a reference to the data table, and then call our setGridSelection that way. So as I've been teaching the class, one question I get a lot is, what if I say querySelector and there's 3 tables on the page? So you can use querySelector all, and you can get a list of all of the different tables that are on your page. Or if you wanted to uniquely identify one, you can assign a class, map1, and over in your container, you could say something like, instead of doing C Astro table, you could do .map1. So you could use any sort of selector strategy that you want. It's flexible. But I just kind of wanted to point that out because that's been a point of confusion the couple of times that I've taught this class so far. So we are able then to, again, create public methods, call public methods on other components, using to broadcast an application event. And then when we go over to our let's have a look here at our, and when we used our pub sub, we imported fire event, which is a method that allows us to use from our pub sub component. When we have our, let's look at the two individual components from the left side. We had our Astro Map and our Astro Table. So I'll start with the Astro Table because you don't have to know anything about Leaflet to look at this one. So for our Astro Table, it's pretty straightforward. I have instantiated a Lightning data table. So the Lightning data table has a number of selected rows. Which rows are selected. It's got a key field, which is going to be the ID. We're going to pass it the data, which is going to be our list of photographs. We're going to pass in the configuration of the columns. So when I instantiate a data table, I need to tell it what are going to be the columns, and then what's the data that goes in those columns. When a row is selected in the data table, I need to do something. And I only want one row selected at a time, and I only want my column to take up so much space. So that's my Lightning data table. And my controller for my Lightning data table is going to look like this. So we have imported, whenever we use one of those decorators, API, track, wire, we have to import them at the top of our controller. We've got our column configuration up here at the top. And what we've got here is whenever our photos, they get passed in from the parent component, we have to format that data so that the Lightning data table is willing to work with it, because it would like for your locations to be formatted with name, location, ID, and tooltip. So we format the data that came in from Apex, we format it so that it is ready for a Lightning data table. So remember that when you see the inside of our Astro table, whenever you see something like selected rows or photos, what that is referring to is something that's coming from your controller, okay? So if I look for what is photos, I need to go over to my controller and see, okay, photos is a property. I didn't really introduce this topic, but we have a notion of getters and setters inside of our Lightning Web Components, so that if you would like to have a property, but anytime somebody gets it or sets it, you'd like to run some additional logic, you can do that with a getter and a setter. You can also decorate your getters or setters with API. You only have to decorate one of them as API, and both of them will be considered public. So our Astro table then is able to essentially, it also has one other thing, set grid selection, which is going to say, here is the currently selected row. We needed that in order to allow us to respond to when somebody clicks on the map up top. We want to call it on the bottom. In our, let me come back here. We have two other components that I just want to highlight for a moment. We have our Astro Map, which was going to be the one up at the top, which accepts that same, our Astro Map is going to accept the same photos that got passed into it. We're going to just have a div that we basically say, let me allow a third-party JavaScript to overwrite me. So that's what this div with an LWC DOM is equal to manual means. And if you go into the JavaScript for this Astro Map HTML file, what we're going to see is, I'm going to go to my astromap.js. We're going to see a number of things here. One of them is that we are importing Leaflet, so that's the name of our third-party mapping library, from a static resource. And we still have a getter for our photos as well as a setter, because we would like to do a certain amount of work. Anytime somebody changes the value of that photos property, we kind of need to repopulate our Leaflet map. And we take advantage of a hook called rendered callback. So whenever you're working with third-party JavaScript, if it needs to manipulate the DOM, this is similar to a renderer inside of our Aura components, which we didn't have to use all that often, but when you work with third-party JavaScript, you would have to use. So we use our rendered callback, and in this example, we're going to load our Leaflet JavaScript and CSS, and when it's done, we would initialize our map, and when we wanted to initialize our map, we've got a number of methods that we made available to us here. But in terms of, let's see, there's a lot of Leaflet type of code here. But In terms of the most kind of interesting stuff, I just want to call your attention to, again, the fact that we have an API method here called set map selection. So that, again, lets us maintain that. It allows us to have a public method so that when you click on a grid item, we can call a public method on the map and go ahead and update it so that the tooltip is showing above the right item. The last thing I want to review from the application is going to be our map detail container, map item detail. So in our map item detail, that's going to be the far right where we're showing our picture of Astro. What we've done is we've got a Lightning card, and we have assigned it we've included an anchor tag so that you can click on an image URL. We've got an image source, which is just image URL here, and a class of image class. We've got a Lightning formatted rich text, which will just contain a description of the picture. And the sort of key concept to take away from this component is if I have the ID of a field, of an object, how do I get the extra information about that object? So this is going to use that getRecord method. And so we're going to call getRecord, and we're going to have all of these fields that we're able to get. So this is kind of our select statement, right? We're selecting all of these different fields. And we are using our wire service in order to say, here's the record ID I'd like to fetch. Here are all of the fields I would like to get, and store them in this property when you're done. We are registering a listener for our pub/sub event, and we are able to also, whenever, let's see here, inside of our image, we have a static resource, and we are using inside of each photo object, so I have a custom object on the back end that stores the name of the static resource that we're using to serve up the image. So that's how we're able to set the image source appropriately. We've got some getter properties here that just display field values once they come back from our Lightning data service. So jumping back, that's like sort of the high-level walkthrough that I just kind of wanted to give of the application, of just the sort of nature of going from Aura to LWC. I know I covered a lot of different components, but I'm ready if you guys wanted to do some Q&A. I am sort of, do you guys have any questions that I can address about Lightning Web Components in general, about this particular project? So again, I've taught the class on Aura Components 601 for a long time. I'm teaching the 602 class. So I'm more than happy to take any questions that you might have.
I have a question on event mechanism, right? In Aura, you register the event, you fire the event,
yes,
and you handle the event, right?
Absolutely.
It's three things. Here, we don't register, right? In this.
Exactly. So we didn't have to go through, so in Aura, we had to, in our component markup, we had to say Aura : register event, right? And we also, not only did we have to register the event, fire it, and handle it, we had to create the event first in an EVT file. So we had to declare an actual, like basically its own little component that we created just to declare what kind of data was going to go in this event. So those two steps of creating the EVT file, don't have to do that anymore, and registering the event inside of the component that would be able to fire it, we don't have to do that anymore. So that's two pieces of code that are gone. So the event handling mechanism's gotten a lot simpler. The other thing I'll say is it was kind of hard and tricky to remember. There's two different syntaxes in Aura, one for component events and one for application events. And it was like, I had to pull out every single time I wanted to use either of them, I had to go back and double check, okay, what's the syntax for Aura versus application events and so forth. Hi.
So my question might sound silly, but
No silly questions here, I can promise.
so what I noticed was for the getter methods,
Yes.
the syntax is very simple, field underscore the field name.
Yeah, so if we,
In the setter method, I think in another JS file, I saw you setting the latitude and longitude.
yeah, so that might
But
have,
they are not the API names of the fields, so I was kind of wondering.
absolutely. So I think what is happening,
Underscore C, I don't know.
yeah, so when the, here we go. So here's an example. So we have a function called populate map, and what we end up doing is we're going to, this populate map function is getting called. Let's see if I can.
So is this the API name of that
So I will show you that in 1 second. So we have a setter called photos, and the setter called photos gets the result as it comes in from Apex with the double underscore C, or in our case, it's latitude and longitude, so it's this weird double underscore S thing. So we're going to call populate map, and this populate map is going to look at this array, this.photos, and what it's going to do is it's going to loop through that array that does use API names, and it's actually going to create a new array, because when we want to populate the map, Leaflet is expecting our map to take an array of objects that look a certain way. It doesn't know anything about double underscore S. It's expecting an array of markers that are that have a latitude and a longitude. So what we're doing is we are essentially, and this is a common thing that you'll see, it happens with our Google Map, with our Lightning data table as well. It doesn't expect to see your data formatted with double underscore C or double underscore S or whatever. It's expecting it in a certain other format. And so what we do is we'll take the data when it comes back from Apex or from an external API or wherever we happen to call it from. We will massage that data, and then we will feed it into whatever component in whatever format we need to. So in this case, the API name of our latitude, of our location is location latitude double underscore S. If you've never worked with latitude and longitude fields, they're kind of an exception to the normal naming conventions for our API names. So because it's a compound field, which means you have one field that has kind of 2 bits of information inside of it. So when you actually go to refer to it, you'll see this location latitude double underscore S. But just imagine this was like, latitude C and longitude C. So from a learning perspective, I would think of it that way, as we are taking the data as it came back from Apex and then massaging it into a new format that our map likes a little bit better. Does that help?
Yeah.
Great.
Any example you can share where we can send data back to the server, like an object back to an Apex method, like a server trip basically?
Yeah, so if you wanted to, so I think what you're asking is, what if I want to make a DML statement?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a couple things about that. So I don't have an example built into Where's Astro, but what I can do is show you, I have the recipes. So for those of you who are not familiar, Lightning Web Components, there is a repository called recipes. And if you fire up a Scratch org with this repository, it's super, super helpful. And what you can do is, it's a little bit hard to see. That's better. So you can see across the top here, we've got tons of different examples. We've got all these different tabs for different code examples that we might care about. So I'm just taking a guess, and I'm trying to remember. One thing I'll say is whenever we're going to do DML commands, we have to use that imperative apex, because we cannot use wire service to do DML statements. So we can either use imperative apex, or if we're writing a single record, we can actually use that. We can use the UI API as well. But so what we can look at, if we go here to Apex, so we can see Apex imperative method for loading, wiring. I'm trying to see if they have any DML operations in this example. Yeah, so this is for Lightning Data Service creating individual records. So here's one where you'd actually be using the, when you see LDS, that's Lightning Data Service, you can think basically UI record API. So here's an example. So what's really cool about this recipes repository is on any of these components, you can click View Source. So I'm going to control-click View Source. It will take you over to GitHub and show you the recipe for that component in particular. So we've got our LDS create record.js, and we can see an example where we are calling, so in this case, we're calling create record from the UI record API. So this is a method that we can import. This is like, again, when we're creating only one record. This is not imperative apex. I know I'm jumping all over the place a little bit here, but so when we want to create an individual record, we can use the UI API the same way that we use it to fetch information about an individual record. But let me see if there is an example here I wanted to see if the recipes have any Let me look at MISC. I don't know if there are any examples. What I would do is go to the LWC documentation. And the other thing that I'll say is the Lightning Web Component documentation is actually quite good. And in this documentation, there's a whole section on working with data. So you can say work with Salesforce data. And you can see call Apex methods. And let me see if there is exposing Apex methods, client-side caching. Let me just look for DML. Okay, so yeah, so basically all you would do is call an Apex method, pass in the parameters, and have the one thing is it cannot be marked as cacheable. When we use wire service and we have our Apex methods, we use an annotation. Anytime you have an Apex method that you want to expose to a component, whether it's a Lightning Web component or an Aura component, you're going to have to mark that Apex method as Aura enabled. And if you would like to use it with wire service, you have to mark it as cacheable is equal to true, which means that the client should cache it whenever it calls it. For those methods, you can't use DMLs inside of those methods. It'll throw an error on you if you try to. But so you could use that same imperative Apex syntax. Let me just see, imperative. Call an Apex method imperatively. And so what you can see, in this example, we're saying get contact list, but we could have said we could have set update contact list and passed an object that had whatever it is that we want to update, and then in our Apex class, just run an update like you would with any other example. So.
So do you mean to say URL record API basically works with single records? That's what you said, right?
Yes, there's a.
There's a bulk record DML we have to call an Apex.
Yes, so if you would like to do an update with anything other than a single record ID, then you're going to have to call an Apex class. Exactly.
So I recently worked on my first Aura project for
Welcome to the party.
and I was with the longer term idea of converting it over to LWC.
Sure.
And so I watched all the videos, I used Visual Studio Code, et cetera, pushing my org, and I just get error and error and error. I can't really get started on projects. So I'm not typically use one of Visual Studio Code from it. Anytime I try to use it, I spend so much time on the config and setup of the dev environment. So I did the whole project on Aura just using
Developer console?
dev console.
Okay.
It's kind of a stupid way to do it, but it
It's,
worked.
but it worked, right? I definitely wouldn't call it stupid. You had a roadblock in your way and you found a way around it.
Simple, I can just work on the code and putting things together and making the data render and use the components. And if I want to go faster, is the only way to do it to do Visual Studio Dev and push it to the org.
Yeah, so are you using, so we have two types of orgs that we work with, right? We have the sandbox production, we call them non-source tracked orgs is the unfancy way of saying it, right? So non-scratch orgs, think of it that way. So are you using regular, like a sandbox kind of a deal?
I was trying both. I was trying the scratch org route.
Okay.
I was just trying to go against one of my.
So a scratch org will be a little bit challenging because you have to untangle the soup or whatever they want to call it, the happy soup, and come up with a representation of an org that when you're working with it, it's actually meaningful. So if you're running into this roadblock and whatever you were doing with dev console, you should be able to, so you can take VS Code and point it at an org that is not source tracked. You don't have to work with scratch orgs just because you want to work with VS Code. And so you can configure VS Code. There's an article on, let's see, Visual Studio Code, and maybe you've already seen it, Visual Studio Code.
I did. I think the last time I tried, I saw this concept of the non-source tracked org to run against that.
Yeah, exactly. So here it's called the org development model. Here we go. You use the org development model with VS Code. And you should be able to create a new project. And one of the sort of key concept is to make sure that might help you out. You create a file called a manifest file, a package.xml, and make sure you only put, just because a lot of times people have these gigantic orgs with all these objects, fields, and so forth. Make sure you're only putting the kinds of things in that package.xml that you need, because it's possible that maybe that's part of your headache, but you can then also just deploy individual files. You can right-click and say, deploy this back to my org. So I would,
So they org development.
yeah, so just look up org development model with VS Code and give that a shot. Because I really like working with VS Code. It's been really good for me. So, you know, it is nice, like the.
What's that?
Illuminated Cloud, have you tried that one?
No, and that's kind of, oh, then I should try something else. So it's like 4 or 5 hours later, I'm like, okay, I should have done this.
Some people like it better, so they can
Okay.
trial and see. Maybe your muscle memory drives better with their UI versus VS Code.
Okay.
And one other thing I'll point out is you won't be able to use the dev console for Lightning Web Components. So you will have to. So you're.
So I just wanted to get out of, like, I think maybe because I was going against the scratch work that I was getting, I was like, no, you're not going to be able to push this over.
Yeah, so taking an org that you work with and trying to make a representative scratch org is a sophisticated problem. So I would work on just try to point your VS Code at a sandbox or whatever your dev sandbox is, and go from there.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you.
Sure.
I faced a similar issue.
Okay.
And I could never connect my scratch org with, I connected to my developer edition org.
Yeah.
And that's a bit easier.
Yeah.
Pull the code from
It's just
Salesforce
kind of-
and then push it.
It's pull and
At least you have to create a project with manifest ID.
Yeah.
Connecting to D org, but scratch org you have to do just to create a project, right?
Yeah, so when you, that's a great point. So yeah, when you do this project on creating an org with, using the org development model, it'll have you execute the package, the command palette command for install with a manifest file. So it'll create a directory called package.xml inside of a directory called manifest. One really quick thing I want to show you guys who I think, this is just for anybody who's been in development for a while, there's a really cool package XML generator where you can choose metadata components for a package XML, and it will actually look at your org and generate a package XML for you. So that's an extension in VS Code that we're actually teaching people to use in our class because some of the instructors that found it so useful. So yeah, sure. It's let me go to my installed extensions. So it was called. Here we go. And this is not built by Salesforce. This is a third-party tool, but Salesforce Package XML Generator. So I would definitely have a look at that too, just because building your package XML can be kind of a tedious task, and it's gotten rave reviews. You can basically, it will connect to your org, and then it will kind of show you a list of a bunch of stuff, and then you can decide, you can check boxes and say, that's the kind of thing I want to call, and it'll put it into your Yeah, you can do that in Eclipse as well. Yeah, exactly. This is a good way to do it in VS Code. Yeah. I think, Daniel, you had.
A couple of NPM projects do the same thing also for more command line stuff.
Oh, cool. And I think before that, you maybe had a question or
Yeah,
comment?
like an architecture question. When you were showing the latitude and longitude,
Absolutely.
and you probably don't have to pull it up, but
Okay.
that transformation you did probably could have also been done in Apex.
Yes.
And see, a lot of times we have these choices. We can put code in JavaScript or Apex, and there's these considerations. One of them is speed, and so I think pretty much always JavaScript is built in on speed.
Yeah.
And then there's the testability, which I'm wondering that a lot of times pushed you to putting in Apex because more of them are testable.
Yes.
Is it, if you have these choices now, because like Apex tests are super slow to run.
Yes, they
So
are.
I'm wondering, like, are we seeing more of these big service classes moving into are there any disadvantages now to putting them in?
So it looks like Adam has a strong opinion. Adam is raising his hands, and I'd love for him to contribute his opinion on this.
I think that historically that was often the case, especially when you wanted something to be testable. It made more sense to have an Apex. But with the significantly closer integration we have between LWC and Jest, especially with the LWC Jest NPM package, you can build your unit tests on the JavaScript side and keep that resource allocation that's putting it on to the client browser. So you're getting both an optimization and speed from your unit testing and also from the actual processing of the data.
So LWC is maybe enabling more of that logic to move into.
Yeah, and it's more, I would say, it feels much more endorsed and like sort of standardized when we move to the web components, because you'll see if you go to the, not that, I mean, we had Lightning testing service, but I don't know, to me that always felt like an afterthought. I don't know if, okay.
It was
Came very late to the party.
Headless browsers trying to do the best they could, so.
Yeah. So we've got our test Lightning Web Components, and this was built right into the docs from the get-go, and it's talking about how to use Jest in order to test your components. So you can do it's very easy to write tests, and if you go to the Lightning Web Components recipes, what's really cool is, let me make sure that I'm right about this before I brag about it. All of these individual components that are available to you on the recipes actually have Jest tests built in. So if you need examples of looking at what's the kind of stuff that the Jest tests can do to kind of see if, are these tests legit? Are they actually going to like test anything real? You can check out the recipes and see how you can go about testing the functionality of all of those individual ones. Don?
To point them at the video gallery, there's a really nice short, about an 8-minute video about setting up and testing for LWC with Jest.
So there was a, let's see, I had a Lightning Web Component video gallery, and scroll down to the bottom.
Setting up a test environment with Jest.
CLI Web Components, and unit testing for Lightning Web Components. So,
The gentleman who was having trouble setting up his development environment, there's also one here about using Visual Studio Code and CLI to deploy Lightning Web Components directly to a sandbox. It's a short video by Sane. So these are great short videos.
so these short videos are available. So this link here is the Lightning Web Component. It's actually Lightning, not lighting. It's the Lightning Web Component video gallery, and I put this link in this Google Doc. So again, as a reminder, this Google Doc, bit.ly/aura2lwc. So you can go from here, get the link. It's got the link to the repository as well. One quick point about the repository. If you decide you want to check it out, normally there's a bunch of step-by-step instructions on how to kind of set the project up. Mine are pretty quick. You go to scripts, and there is a create org shell script. So if you're on a Mac, you can just run this once you've got a dev hub set up. If you've never worked with Scratch orgs, you might want to go and just do this, go and do the dev hub Scratch org like thing and just have a look at that. But you can just go ahead and run this shell script, or on Windows, you could run these 4 commands one by one. I would know that I was intimidated. I think I see you kind of smiling and laughing. Are you a little intimidated by the Scratch orgs?
Yeah, I mean, I really like that time, like I was able to work in 3 years.
So what I would recommend is just work with like a vanilla Scratch org. So these are projects, like this project is built like from the get-go, just with Scratch orgs in mind. It is a very difficult problem to work from your actual corporate environment to have that work with Scratch orgs. Or I mean, I should say it is a problem. I don't know, depending upon your environment, it might not be that bad. But yeah, just for the sake of like learning the concepts around web components, I think it can be helpful.
And that's a nice question, right? So how do we decide to be Scratch or Dev or whatever the enterprise or like
Yes.
in enterprise now we get power sandboxes, Dev boxes. Absolutely need to use Scratch at that point.
Yeah, so that is I think that is a topic that could be almost its own entire meetup. Is that appropriate? And there's a great, yes.
Sipping the happy soup, and it's about how to think differently about your development in a Scratch org environment, in SFDX, and how to isolate, and also how to work with mono packages. There's a couple of really good perspectives from some really sharp people. Suggestions for watching.
So I'm going to put,
Pluralsight link.
yeah, so sipping
The happy soup.
the happy soup. So I got the link.
Actually presented here about that topic some year ago.
I think you presented a Dreamforce last year also.
Like anything, it's easier to do it when you're starting with a clean slate.
You have to think, it's like eating an elephant, you gotta think in small ways.
Is it true that the Scratch org, whether it's connected to how, or whether it's like essentially Scratch org, it's only valid for 30 days, right? Not beyond 30 days. Then after 30 days, it expires.
So a Scratch org that you create does expire, but there's an important thing. The idea behind a Scratch org is you ought to be able to throw it away after a day. So what we teach you about in our couple of developer classes is we teach you, so in 602 we do work with DevHub and Scratch orgs, and we teach you about the fact that we've got, so we initially provide you with sort of a regular old DevHub which has all of the objects and everything we want to work with. But the key to a Scratch org is you need to be able to reproduce it really well. So you need to be able to programmatically provide it with the metadata and the data that you need to feed to it. So getting the metadata out of your org is one piece of the problem, right? And you can, there's lots of ways to do that. And then you have to also decide what data you want to get out of the org and be able to programmatically reproduce your Scratch org. So there is a 30-day limit, but in theory, like that shouldn't be the problem. The hard part is just making your Scratch org something that you can programmatically reproduce. And so deciding what metadata do I need and what data do I need to make this a meaningful development environment for me.
Significant paradigm shift, which you don't have to do anything, but you really want to try to cross it. And you just have to start. Just start simple, really simple. And as you get into it, and you start writing scripts, it's sort of like it builds as a synergy in terms of how exciting it gets and what you can do.
And I think the other thing to think about is it's not an all or none proposition, right? So you can decide just for this one feature, I'm going to build out a Scratch org that has the metadata and the data that I need for this one feature that I'm working on. And again, the benefits, like if you have a large dev team and you don't want to spin up, a sandbox for each one of them, that kind of becomes, if you get it worked out, it's really, really helpful. But try to start with, like Don said, start with something small and don't think of it as an all or none kind of a deal.
And you might not start with a Scratch org. Start with getting to understand the command line interface, SFDX, which you will use with Visual Studio. You don't have to use it with a Scratch org. You can use it just to manage commands and scripts, move stuff around, to be able to do local development and on your code in Visual Studio, and then push it into a sandbox, or push something from a sandbox into production, or use it to do a software query, look at your data, look at your metadata. There's happens to be another great play-by-play, like Kieran Godwin, he's a CTA in the UK, all about what the CLI can do. And again, you got to start bite-sized. Don't get overwhelmed by it.
See if I can grab plural site. Here we go.
Salesforce command line.
Do you think LWC is ready for prime time in terms of like your most mission critical apps? Is it mature enough for that, or is it more kind of still for like little small projects, getting your feet wet?
I think everything that it can do is ready for prime time. This is me speaking. This is my estimation. So my understanding is that it was getting used under the hood by Salesforce for all of their like base components for a long time before they even announced it, right? So when I as an Aura developer would build a Lightning button, under the hood it was actually using a Lightning web component button, and they just didn't tell us that for a long time. The question, I don't really think the stability of the Lightning web components is going to be an issue, and in fact, I think you're going to see a performance improvement, and you're going to see all the investment going in that direction by Salesforce. The only thing that I've heard about and again, I've only had really one customer I've been on site with that was working with Lightning web components significantly, and they had a couple of areas where the parity wasn't there yet in terms of feature set. So they were heavy Service Console users, and I think Aura has really nice tie-in with the Service Console API, and that wasn't there yet in Lightning web components. So that was an example where they didn't have it wasn't that there was a problem with Lightning web components, it's just that something wasn't available yet. So that's my take on it, is and I think that those gaps are getting bridged pretty quickly. So I would always, if I was building in a green field, so kind of what I've told people is I've gone on to clients and said, if you have a large investment in Aura components and you're maintaining an existing application, unless you're having performance issues, I wouldn't rewrite for the sake of rewriting. But if you are starting with a green field and you are creating a new application or a new piece of your application, I would use Lightning web components. The other thing I'd keep in mind is they are interoperable. So you can use Aura components in one piece, you can use Lightning web components elsewhere. Really the only limitation there is that your Lightning web components cannot contain Aura, but you can do the opposite. Your Aura components can contain Lightning web components. So again, it comes similar to with DX versus the org development model. You don't have to think of it as an all or none proposition either. So I personally would work with Lightning web components.
Take the leap of faith, and if there's something missing, hopefully it'll be built by the time you finish
Yeah,
project.
and I think where you're coming from, and I was not a Salesforce guru when Aura launched, right? But I have kind of heard horror stories about like it just wasn't. I feel like it got launched before it was maybe really ready for prime time. I don't know. Maybe other people in the room can chip in with their experiences or not. If any of you want to, that's cool. If not, no worries. But that's kind of just something I've heard through the grapevine. And I think with Lightning Web Components, it's been a very different experience. Like everything, it's felt very rock solid to me. It's felt really good when I've worked with it. So.
I was definitely one of those people who was very hesitant when it came to Aura. I love the concept, but there are a lot of things that I couldn't get done. Lightning Web Components has been, it's a completely different beast, right? One, it's a lot easier to build out more customization than you need to. Because the tools are so ubiquitous and you're solving problems in a paradigm that the rest of the internet is already using. So even if it hasn't been done on the Salesforce platform, it's likely been done in very similar patterns somewhere else on the internet. And at the same time, like you said, because the development framework is so much faster and it's so much easier to iterate, things are being deployed very, very quickly. So yeah, maybe by the time you actually get to that aspect of your project, something will exist in the ecosystem that you can then access. I think that at least personally, the default is going to be try to build it in LWC first before I look at other maybe slightly more seasoned options. If that makes sense.
So what you said, activate track basically re-renders the component.
So anytime you change the property, it will re-render the component.
That could affect the performance. So there could be a page where there are multiple Lightning components and you are using activate tracks functions. Suppose everywhere.
Okay.
So each component will be re-rendered or every.
No, so if I have, let's say, 10 tiles on a page, and the ID of a tracked property in one of them changes, it renders just that individual one. It's not going to re-render all the ones on that page.
And just help me understand.
Sure.
Does it re-render means it gets the copy of the server or it's cached?
No, think of it as the browser like recreates it or redraws the screen. So imagine you have a name property and you've got a tile that shows the name of a person, and then in the JavaScript controller that you change that name. The question is, does the display reflect your changes that you did in code? So that's not something that happens automatically unless you declare your variable as an attrack property. So, does that help? Cool. A lot of good questions.
I think, back in the days of Digital Forest, we'd be juggling massive view states back and forth between the server, right? Yes, we're re-rendering these components, but it's all happening within the client. Like, yes, it's not the same scenario at all. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.